All right, good morning. My name is Dan Margulies. I'm filling for Rabbi Linzer while he's away. Today is the 20th of Av. It's the 24th of August, and we will be picking up toward the bottom of Pei Daled Amud Bet, where the Gemara says Tsa'ar. So the Mishnah had said Tsa'ar. In what circumstances do you pay? Or not what circumstances, but how do we evaluate the payment for pain and suffering? So the Mishnah had suggested an analysis that said Tsa'ar kiva'o b'shipudo b'masmer afilu al tiporno makom she'eino sechabura omdim kama adam kayote b'zaroteli tol liyot mitzdaer kach. What would you do to assess pain and suffering? Suppose a person either stabbed someone or burned someone with something very thin and sharp, some sort of a spear, some sort of a nail, and even on the fingernail, which is a place which does not leave a bruise. I don't know. I've had bruises under my fingernail before. Maybe it doesn't mean bruise. Maybe it means the wound. That is, if someone would poke you on your fingernail, you can assess how much pain it would be, even if it doesn't leave any permanent mark. That is, the fingernail is more resistant. Or maybe it means underneath the fingernail is a very sensitive spot. Hard to tell. Okay, but makom she'eino sechabura, that's going to become important. A place that does not leave a wound or does not leave a bruise, we evaluate how much a person like this, that is a similar person, would be willing to pay, or would be willing to be paid in order to undergo such suffering. That is, if you tell me, I'll say, how much should I give you to let me poke you with this needle, or how much would you let me pay you in order to chop off your finger, or something like that. So we're gonna have to see how the Gemara goes into that. But the first discussion is going to be about this question of leaving a wound or leaving a bruise behind. So the Gemara says, "Tzar kavau b'shipuda b'basmer."
Isn't cutting a finger, isn't that a further extension?
So we're going to have to see. The amputation of a limb is going to obviously have much more other parts of the damages to be assessed as well. So the Gemara says, "Tzar shelo b'makom nezek mishtalem." You could even pay tsa'ar, that is for pain and suffering, even if there's no nezek, even if there's no permanent damage. What does that mean? That means if there is an injury which could fully heal, so there's no devaluation or no appreciable long-term damage that this person undergoes because of this injury. The only thing is pain and suffering. So that's why the question of whether it leaves a bruise or not becomes important, because the bruise or the wound could be something that lasts forever. But if it's even in a place that does not leave a bruise, then you could understand that tsa'ar could be paid even when there's no nezek. We saw previously that some of the other four would be mishtalim b'makom nezek. Only in a case where you would pay nezek would you also pay these. We're going to see as well some of the others become equated, like shevet comes connected with ripui. So here, tsa'ar even shelo b'makom nezek mishtalim man tana. So which Tana is that? That is, which Tana is our Mishnah like? That is, that you would pay Tsa'ar even if there's no Nezek. Amarava ben Azaihi. It must be Ben Azai's opinion. Ditanya, we have a Braita which explicates this machloket more fully. Ben Azaihi, Ditanya Rabbi Omer Kiviyane Emra Techila. The pasuk referring to the different types of injuries included under Ayin Tachat Ayin says Kiviyah first. Kiviyah, at least for now, let's say it means a burn. But it's not clear necessarily. It means they're referring to an injury which may or may not be presumed to leave some kind of permanent injury. We're going to see that's the machloka between Rabbi and Ben Azai. So Rabbi says, Kiviyah ne'emrat techila. Ben Azai omer chabura ne'emrat techila. Ben Azai, either analyzing another pasuk that lists them in a different order, or perhaps parsing the pasuk differently, suggests that chabura, a bruise or a wound, is what's mentioned first. How can they have this kind of machlokas? So Rabbi Savar kiviyah deleit bechabura mashma. So a kiviyah, your instinct would be to assume that kiviyah does not leave a wound or does not leave a bruise for a long-term injury. So katav rachmana chabura legayululei Allah. The kiviyah deit bechabura in ilo lo. So therefore the Torah was explicit and said not only kiviyah but also mentioned the word chabura to teach you that only if there is also a chabura would you pay for tsa'ar. That is, only if there's also nezek would you pay tsa'ar. That's Rebbe's position. Uben Azai savar kiviyah de'it ba chabura mashma. Our instinct would be to assume that a kiviyah does have a long-term injury, does create a chabura. So katab rachmana chabura legaluya elad kiviyah deleit be chabura. and therefore, so the Torah was explicit to mention chabura to teach you that kiviyah could refer even to an injury that does not cause a long-term damage, and therefore Ben Azai would say you would pay for tsa'ar shelo b'makom nezek. So Rebbe thinks kiviyah, you would naturally assume, refers to an injury which does not cause a long-term damage. Therefore, the Torah was explicit to mention chabura to exclude those injuries which do not have a long-term damage. Ben Azai thinks it's the opposite. Kiviyah, you would think kiviyah means something that does have a long-term damage. Therefore, the Torah was explicit to mention chabura to say kiviyah could even refer to an injury which does not have long-term damage. Okay. And therefore, they have a machloket whether or not you would pay tsa'ar in a case where there was no nezek, where there was no devaluation of the person's price on the slave market, that is no real long-term lasting physical injury. It's just about the pain and suffering temporarily, but it will heal.
Do you think, is this a hermeneutic of like klal or prat or prat and klal?
We're going to get there.
Okay, sorry.
So Rav Papa. So Rav Papa disagrees with Rava's analysis. And Rav Papa says like this, Adraba, ipcha bistabra. No, the opposite makes more sense to say like this. Rebbe omer kiviyah ne'emra tichila. Rebbe thinks that the pasuk mentions kiviyah first. Savar kiviyah de'ipa chabura mashma. Sounds like kiviyah is one that does create a wound. It does create a bruise. So katav rachlana chabura lagalui ala de kiviyah deleipa chabura. So then the Torah was explicit to mention chabura to tell you that it's including something that does not cause a wound. Ben Azai omer chabura ne'emra tichila. So Ben Azai thinks the Torah mentioned chabura first. So savar kiviyah deleipa chabura mashma. He thinks that kiviyah means a wound, an injury that does not cause a lasting wound. Mashma kata rachlana chabura. Therefore, the Torah mentioned chabura to include legalu yala dikviyah deipa chabura in ilolo, to distinguish between those injuries which do create a lasting wound that you would pay tsa'ar and nezek, and to exclude those that do not leave a lasting injury that you would be exempted even from tsa'ar. Okay, so Rav Papa reads the Braita exactly the opposite of Rava. Okay. So it sounds like our conclusion should be that the word kiviyah does refer to an injury even if it does not create a lasting injury. No, the machloket between Rabbi and Ben Azai is not actually about what the word kiviyah means or what the word chabura means and how the Torah is talking about those kinds of injuries. Rather, they're having machloket about how to apply a drasha, which is usually where most of our machlokot come from. And their disagreement is about how do we apply the principle klal uprat if the klal and the prat are far apart from each other. Klal uprat usually says we have a general statement and followed immediately by some of the details. So we say that the klal, the generality, is limited to apply only to cases which are similar or comparable to the prat. The question is, what if the prat is not right next to it, but what if it's a few words separated? So that's the question. Rebbe Savar ein danino to b'klal uprat. Right, it's 4 words apart, and Rashi discusses what are the words in between, like pasuk. Right? No, but so Rashi discusses it. So there you go. So patza is in between kiviyah and chabura. So Rebbe Savar ein danino to b'klal uprat. Rebbe thinks, therefore, because of the words describing the petza is another kind of injury, are in between the kiviyah, the burn, and the chabura, the bruise. So therefore, you could not apply klal uprat, and therefore chabura does not come to limit what kind of kiviyah you would have. And therefore, Rebbe would say, even if it does not cause a long-term injury, you would still pay tsa'ar, even if there is no nezek. Okay? Danino to b'klal uprat. Ben Azai savar danino to b'klal uprat. And Ben Azai thinks, even if there's a few words in between, you would still apply klal uprat. V'chitein lachabura de Rebbe lamali. So then, why does Rebbe have to have the word chabura at all? Because he can apply this klal uprat. So he says ledamim miterim. So what does ledamim miterim mean? It sounds like that there's a certain additional amount that you would pay, not just to pay the tsa'ar, but also to pay nezek. That is, if it causes a chabura, you also have to pay for the nezek. It's not just the tsa'ar. Our whole formulation up until now had been nezek is basically primary. Every kind of damage case, you're paying nezek. And then the question is, with Parak HaChovel, we were introduced to the other 4. That is, and then on top of the nezek, there are other things you have to pay for if one person injures another. So here, Rebbe kind of flips it around a little bit. That is, between human beings, the fundamental thing that you're paying for, seemingly, is actually tsa'ar. You're paying for the pain that you caused with this injury. And then the question is, and if it leaves a permanent injury that will never heal, if you cut off someone's finger, if you cut off someone's nose, if they have a big scar, then the question is going to be, okay, so now how do we assess the nezek? But in terms of human beings, rather than kelim, let's say, your house falls down, that's something where the appreciable damage is what's most readily apparent. Between human beings, actually the tsa'ar is the primary component. That's because it's sort of most locally centralized in the person. We're going to see later on this daf. This daf actually has a lot of the many different medical themes. So it's certainly an interesting topic. So let's keep going. The Gemara says, that is, if you're on a game show and they're going to say, okay, we're going to hit you with the sledgehammer, we'll pay you $50,000, and would you agree to that?
It's not a game show that,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't mean to rely on too many stereotypes, but there is a sense of a stereotype that certain Japanese game shows are very cruel kinds of punishments and things like that. What is it? The Simpsons episode? They said your game shows reward intelligence. Our game shows punish ignorance, or something like that. So anyway, okay. So Kamma Adam disgusting bug or something. Right, or eating a tray of bugs. Okay, so the Gemara says we have to assess how much a person like this would be willing to be paid in order to undergo this kind of suffering. So tsa'ar b'makom nezek chlishay mina. But then, how can you assess tsa'ar in a case where there was also nezek? Why? Because the payment that the person would be willing to accept is going to cover both the tsa'ar and the nezek. Because if you're going to say, how much would you be willing to let us pay you to cut off your finger, but that's including the permanent damage that's incurred, that is, your person will no longer have a finger, and the pain and suffering. So there's no way to decouple the tsa'ar from the nezek. That's the Gemara's question. So Amar Avua de Shmuel's father.
No, I'm sorry, I thought you do. I mean, because that's the value on the slave market. That's what nezek.
No, but then we know how to evaluate the nezek. Nezek you evaluate by saying slave market value. And then tsa'ar, you're supposed to say, how much would this person want to be paid in order to undergo this kind of pain? The problem is if I say, okay, so you chopped off someone's finger, so now we have to figure out how much money we should pay you in Beit Din for that. Then the question becomes, so how do I evaluate the tsa'ar? I say, how much would you be willing to be paid in order to cut off your finger? The problem is, cutting off your finger is an act which includes both nezek and the tsa'ar and boshet and right. Each one of those.
But that's not the question. The question is how much pain would we willing, just from a pain, and then you say.
But then there's no way for a human being to process just the pain, because a person immediately to think, what is it going to be that I'm going to have to live without my finger for the rest of my life? That's going to include what's included in the nezek as well. So you're going to be double counting the nezek.
No, but this is a very subjective scale to use. If somebody has a lot of money, they're not going to. They don't. What are they going to say about this? I want to. I'll take this much money to have that done. Right, you're saying, and this is why there's a concern about the black market organs, is that people who are less financially well off might be more inclined to sell a kidney at a price which is less than what it's really worth, because they want quick money fast and they're willing to something like that. So that may be a bias in this process that is incredibly subjective.
This seems very simple answer. How much are we willing to pay to undergo an anesthetic and do it? Versus how much you pay to do the
We're going to get to that. That's the Gemara's answer, more or less. So let's see the Gemara's answer. We said, hey, okay. So,
there's a difference between, the effect of pain on somebody and trying to objectify it in terms of a monetary.
Right. Well, that's incredibly true. That's exactly part of this question. So we can see. So Amar Avua de Shmuel. So Shmuel's father, we see Shmuel's father a number of places in Shas. Sometimes Shmuel's
a doctor, wasn't he?
Shmuel, I think there's some suggestion that Shmuel, I mean, again, a doctor in the 3rd, 4th century is not exactly the same as doctor nowadays.
At that time.
At that time, it was better than nothing. That's true. Well, maybe it depends. Okay. Amar Avua de Shmuel. Din Kamma Adam Roteli Tol. So we see how much a person would be willing to take liktoa lo yado, to cut off his hand. Liktoa lo yado lo tsa'ar l'chudei. So how can you, that's exactly the point I was just saying. That is, Avua de Shmuel suggests, so just see how much a person is willing to have the hand cut off, but then you're going to get into the problem of how do you decouple tsa'ar from nezek? How do you get tsa'ar l'chudei? How do you get the tsa'ar by itself? So hakulhu chamisha dvarnika. It has all 5 things. V'od, b'shofteni askinan. Okay, we're talking about a case where sort of they're saying like you have to deal with it quickly. You have to deal with the case. Ella like
Sorry, what is shofteni?
Shofteni, I think.
I always thought it meant like someone silly. Who would want to do that? Yeah.
Fine. The point is that the person is on the person who any person who would be willing to actually assess that. No person is going to give you a realistic value for that kind of assessment. Because the person say, "Are you crazy? I'm going to cut off my hand." Like, there's no such evaluation.
This is Islam responding to Abu Shmuel.
Correct. Right. They have two problems. Number one, you can't decouple tsar from the other four, and number two, it sounds absurd. Like no sane person would be willing to even have a conversation with you about how much money was involved.
Do you have it's very interesting, like, because the word I see there is shofet in there,
right?
Which honestly is not what they're saying.
Right.
It's very interesting, like if there's like some sort of
I don't know the etymology of the word. Okay. So then we'll say, so how much would you be willing to cut off your hand that's already cut off?
What is that?
Okay. So presumably it means that the person has some sort of, or no, that a person maybe has a degenerative illness, and the question is, the person has a gangrenous hand or something like that. It already has an infection, and it's gonna fall off on its own, or someone has leprosy or something, and the injury is such that the limb will be lost no matter what. The question is, okay, so now, like, I could cut it off now, and it will be painful, or it'll happen on its own eventually.
Yeah,
kind of
not
thing.
The same thing. You didn't do that.
It's not the same thing. So we're gonna see. So okay, So why? Ika hat tsar or boshet ika. So it has both tsar and boshet too, because you're quickening the point in time at which this person no longer has a hand. It's a certain amount of embarrassment involved in having an amputation. Obviously, part of that question is involved in discussing the broader question about how people with physical disabilities are treated in our society. If we are assuming that there is some sort of embarrassment involved in having a physical disability, obviously that means something also about how people should be acting toward people who have these injuries and these disabilities as well. Okay, so it's very graphic. Why? Because what's going to happen? That limb will be amputated, and they're going to take it and take from your flesh and just throw it to the dogs.
That's very interesting. Like, what about don't have to bury these things? I hear.
That's exactly the question. So in one of the tshuvot about what to do in cases of amputation, I think it's from the Shvut Yaakov, he discusses all the other Gemaras that talk about, well, if you have an amputated limb, that's Ever Min HaChai. So Ever Min HaChai we know is Mitameh. That is, a Kohen certainly can't be involved in handling or even being in the same room as an amputation and things like that, which involves many complications for Kohanim who want to become surgeons or even doctors in general. But that's a whole separate question. But the other question is, Ever Min HaChai, we usually think, part of the reason we bury people, and we should bury amputated limbs as well, is because to prevent Kohanim from coming in contact with Tumat Meit, to prevent Kohanim from becoming impure from those things. So then you would presume that Ever Min HaChai, an amputated limb, should be buried. But this Gemara seems, the Shvut Yaakov quotes at least, as maybe one of the few sources in Shas that suggests an amputated limb does not need to be buried. So he discusses it. Basically, lahalacha, we don't think that this is acceptable or appropriate, but it's an interesting source in the Gemara to have. The Gemara is suggesting, according to this Gemara, it sounds like you don't have to bury it.
I understand.
Okay, so it's machlokas. So machlokas within the Gemara, and the way halacha has come down to us that you do bury it.
What about, I hear also that we do bris milah.
The milah, there's a question what to do with the orla. It's a little bit question. Also, the amount of flesh. It's not a body part that has a bone in it. It has a very minimal amount of flesh. It's a different sort of. There are all these halachot in the Masechet Ohalot. So the Eivarim that are mitameh has to have a bone, and it has to have a certain amount of flesh, kazai, mitameh, or even things. So all of those kind of things, even a small limb, because even if it's less than a kazai, but it has a bone, has the whole bone, so that becomes so that's a whole masachet. That's the bone separate to itself, and that's the question: which ones are only b'magam masa and which ones are be'ohel? And the whole masachet ohalot is one of the most difficult masachtot. Discusses with that. Okay, so that's the discussion there. So this Gemara suggests at least that part of the boshet involved is that the person who is having this amputation, the limb will be thrown to the dogs to eat. Okay. Ella omdin kama adam rotze litol liktoa yado hamuchtav lemalchut. So a person who is already sentenced to have his hand cut off by the wicked government, and now the question is, how much is he willing to pay to have it done bein besam l'sayif? That is, to do it medically rather than as a punishment. That is, to be done with medicines or some kind of, maybe we would say anesthetic, something like that, compared to having it removed in a very painful way. What? Yeah, exactly. So Amri, Hachanami lo shakul mitzar nafshe. Omdim kam adam rotel litain liktoa lo yado hamuchtav l'malchut bein saif l'sam. So hi litol litain. So what does it mean litol? Litol means to take, but is it that he is taking? But one place it said litain. So basically, bibayle ala amar Rav Huna brei Rav Yehoshua litol ze mizeh. So ze shenatan ze. That is, whenever there's monetary exchange, it might be called litol to take the money. It might be called litain to give the money. Whatever, use the same word to describe opposite sides of the equation, but they're the same process. Okay, so what about ripui? Ripui hikahu. So if a person hits someone, chayav l'rapoto, you have to heal him. Okay, so you say, so Tana Rabbanan. What about the Mishnah had said alubo tzmachim machmar hamaka? If there were some kind of scabs or growths that grew out after the injury because of that injury, vinistera hamaka,
meaning complications.
Some kind of complications, the wound healed up and it opened up again, and it healed up and it opened up again, right? So vinistera hamaka chayav l'rapoto. You still have an obligation to heal it. V'chayav litain lo d'mei shivto, and you have to pay for time off of work. We're going to see that soon. Shelo machmar hamaka eino chayav l'rapoto, but eino chayav litain lo d'mei shivto. You're not obligated, if it was not because of the injury, you're not obligated to heal it, and you're not obligated to pay for time off of work. Rabbi Yehuda omer af machmar hamaka chayav l'rapoto, but ein chayav litain lo d'mei shivto. Rabbi Yehuda says if there were growths, that is some sort of extended injury that keeps healing and reopening and healing and reopening. So Rabbi Yehuda would say, in such a case, you do have to pay the ripui, you do have to pay medical expenses, but you do not have to pay time off of work for that kind of protracted injury. Because the shevet, the time off of work, should only apply to the initial injury and not to the complications. The Chachamim omrim shivto v'refuato kol shechayav b'shevet chayav b'ripui. So Chachamim say, ripui and shevet, whatever one is obligated, the other is obligated. They come together.
They're the Tanna Kamma, right?
That's the Tanna Kamma, exactly. So the Chachamim is Tanna Kamma.
It's just a response.
It's the Gemara sort of explicating the Shita of Chachamim in a more precise way. Okay, and if you're exempted from paying shevet, if you're exempted from paying for time off of work, then you're also exempt from paying for medical expenses. B'mai kamipalgi, I'm a rabba, sha'ashkechinhu l'rabanan b'bei rav, d'yadvid kamri hacha b'maka nitna le'aged kamipalgi. They're talking about an injury that should be, or how much should it be appropriate to bandage a wound. Okay, because we could understand, at least in their time, if the fewer bandages you have, it's going to hurt more now, but it will heal faster. We know that certain kinds of bandages, especially if they decrease the amount of blood flow to the wound, could actually slow the healing process. So if you put too many bandages or you wrap them too tight, it's going to slow down the healing.
That's
so,
a verb, le'aged?
Le'aged, to bind. Like lulav, sorry, eged, right? The lulav has to be, right.
No,
or eged, the Israeli bus company.
As a noun. I just, that's all.
Oh yeah, no, nitna le'aged, to be bound up.
Okay.
A wound that is suitable or is appropriate to be bound up. Rabbanan sabre maka nitna le'aged. So the rabbis, that is Chachamim, think it is appropriate to bind a wound. And therefore, even though it slows down the healing, that's part of the initial, that's the proper way to deal with this injury. And therefore, even if it takes a long time, you should pay shevet as well. The Rabbi Yehuda savar maka lo nitna le'aged. So, and Rabbi Yehuda thinks, yeah, the doctor might tell you to do that, but fundamentally it's not necessary for the healing. Therefore, since you could let it heal faster, the fact that you're prolonging the healing is actually, it's your liability. It's not the person who caused the injury's liability. So that becomes a question, in any kind of, this kind of ripui evaluation is, suppose the doctor gives you two options. The doctor says you can have, 6 months of this kind of therapy, but it's going to be very slow, and it's the safe route, but it's a long time. Or we could be done in a week and a half, but it's going to be very painful, and it's going to be higher risk.
Oh, you have risk. It might not heal properly.
Right. So any of those kind of options, so the doctor gives you both options. How do you say which is appropriate choice, which is inappropriate? How much shevet do you have to pay in that kind of a case? Those are all, major questions. Or even the ripui question. The doctor gives you two options. There's the foolproof method that's going to cost this much, and there's a riskier option that might cost less, or it might be, less painful or more experimental, things like that, but it's going to have more risks involved. So all of those questions are really going to raise the question of what's nitna le'aged, what is actually the appropriate way to deal with this wound or injury, and how do you evaluate that? Okay, so ripui d'tana beikra mechayev, shevet lo tana beikra lo mechayev. So in that case, that is Rabbi Yehuda's shita, is that ripui, because the Torah had obligated it, then you're still obligated to pay ripui because the Torah made it explicit that you still have to pay for the ripui, but not the shevet.
What do you mean? Rashi told you to know before you pay. You have to pay shevet.
You have to pay shevet, but only shevet during the appropriate time of the ripui, not for the entire time it actually takes to heal.
How do you know to make that distinction?
That's Rabbi Yehuda's position.
The Torah isn't clear
Because
either way.
The Torah is not clear either way. I agree.
Rashi says it's la, not to. He's choosing. He's
Right, like I guess that's the point. The discretionary aspect of this
He's
choice.
electing to extend this treatment on his own.
Right. So then you still have to pay for however much the healing process costs, because that's still part of the injury, but the shevet at the time of work, you wouldn't have to pay. Okay. The amina lahu ana. If so, then the rabbis can respond to Rabbi Yehuda if the injury is not meant to be bound up. Okay. So ripui nami lo mechayev. Why should he have to pay for his choice to have it medically treated in this way if you think that that's not appropriate? Rather, everyone agrees that the right way to deal with this wound is that you should wrap it up with this bandage, but that you shouldn't overly bind it. That is because that's going to slow down the healing. So Rabbi Yehuda thinks, since you should not do it too much, therefore that gets you off the hook for shevet, but since it's part of the ripui clause in general, you still have to pay for the ripui in that case. The Rabbanan Savre, and the rabbis think, and the rabbis think that shevet and ripui you always pay together because they're connected. The pasuk says, like Michael quoted, rak shivto yitain, you have to pay for shevet, v'rapo yirapeh, and you have to heal the person as well. So each of those clauses, according to the rabbis, according to Chachamim, because they're connected, you pay one when you pay the other. So whatever medical route the person takes that's based on appropriate medical advice, obviously, then you would have to pay shevet throughout that period as well.
I'm not understanding. So what does the igud yitera have to do with shevet?
Because
we did it appropriately.
Because the igud yitera will slow down the healing.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're going to have a longer period of time when you're off of work.
Okay.
And therefore, that'll incur a greater cost for shevet.
But he's not talking about an igud yitera case.
No, he is. That's exactly what we're talking about. That's the ukimta that the Gemara has said that that's the ukimta that we have to make for this machlok between Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, is that they're talking about igud yitera. That is something which is medically sometimes suggested. Chachamim think that that's appropriate course of action. Rabbi Yehuda thinks it's actually a bad course of action because it slows down the healing too much. Or at least from the perspective of Nezikin, if you go down that route, we can't make this other person liable because you had another option. You could have chosen the faster route, which would have, again, we're trying to get someone to pay for someone else's time off of work. We're trying to get someone to pay for someone else's medical expenses. So in order to actually make him pay, you have to have a high threshold of proof. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda savar shevet lo mechayev b'tayim derachmana rak. So why does Rabbi Yehuda reject the...
So if this is medical malpractice, why should I pay?
It's not malpractice, that they're both options.
Yeah, I thought igud yitera is a bad thing.
According to Rabbi Yehuda, he thinks it's a bad thing from the perspective of Nezikin. That is, it slows down the healing. So the fact that you're trying to now say, I did this medical practice, well, but you could have done it faster, and therefore I don't have to pay your shevet because I could have done it faster. Okay.
So igud yitera doesn't mean malpractice. It just means
I don't think it means malpractice. It means you have two options. One is fast and one is slow.
Look, my dental plan will pay for a plastic crown. It won't pay for a porcelain crown. I have two options. I can put plastic, they'll pay for it. But porcelain, it'll last my whole life, but they're not going to pay a penny.
Right.
Well, let's say you pick the doctor and then there is malpractice somewhere.
Malpractice is a separate question. We're going to get to malpractice today as well. We have to keep going. Okay.
So would he have to pay at least for the amount that it would have...
Correct. The amount of time from the regular shevet. Correct. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda, why does Rabbi Yehuda reject the hekesh between ripui and shevet? Because the pasuk says, because it says, rak shivto yitain. Rak means you would only pay shevet under limited circumstances, even if you would be paying ripui. For Rabbanan, rak, l'shelo machman hamaka huda'ata. The rabbis interpret rak differently. That is, you pay shevet to exclude things which are not because of the injury. Rabbanan batrai da amrei kol shechayev b'shabbat chayav b'shevet chayav b'ripui. And the rabbis therefore learned that the pasuk says kol, so kol comes to teach that shevet and ripui are equated. The kol she'enu chayav b'shevet enu chayav b'ripui. And if you're not obligated to pay shevet, then you're not obligated to pay ripui. Okay. Ripui, the Tana Bekra, so the fact that the Torah repeated the word ripui, rapoi rapei, was repeated. Okay, so lamali mibayle lichditanya. So why does the pasuk say rapoi rapei, a double language? Because we have to learn the drasha of the Tana Debei Rabbi Ishmael, the Tana from the school of Rabbi Ishmael. The Tanya Debei Rabbi Ishmael Omer rapoi rapei. You should surely heal it, but heal. Mikan shenitan reshut leropei lerapot. There is permission granted for doctors to heal. Now, the question is, why does a doctor need permission? What does it mean, permission? So that's part of the question. If you look in Tosfot here, shenitnan reshut leropei lerapot, a doctor has permission to heal. Vim tomar ham merapei lechudim. Okay, v'yishlomar dahalamina hanimile makabi de adam. Maybe a doctor is only allowed to heal injuries that a person caused. That is what the Torah is talking about. But your havamina would have been that an injury or an illness that comes from God that is totally naturally caused. Okay, if you're going to go and try to heal that, you're going against God's will, right? Isn't this what some religions believe, right? A person contracts a certain illness, and then they say, okay, I'm not going to take any medical treatment. Whatever God wants to do for me, God should do. Gzerat HaMelech. I believe that that's God punishing me or something like that. So we say, Kamash Malan Deshari. No, this comes to teach that even for illnesses, that is, even things that are caused by disease, things sent by God, nonetheless, human beings have the right and perhaps an obligation to heal those as well. We have to see, the Rambam doesn't quote this drasha. Now, the Rambam was a doctor. The Rambam doesn't quote this drasha that says there's reshut, there's permission. So why? Because the Rambam thinks it's not permission, it's an obligation. The Rambam in Perish HaMishnah to Masechet Nedarim learns the obligation to provide medical healing is from the sense of v'hashivot lo, by hashavat aveda, returning a lost object, and he makes a kal vachomer.
That's right.
If you have to return someone's property, kal vachomer, that if they're sick, you have to return their health to them, return their life to them. So the Rambam learns actually a even more extreme version of the sense of medical responsibility. A few other points. The point about Gezerat HaMelech, Ramban also was a doctor. So Ramban in Parashat Bechukotai talks about a much debated passage that talks about how much Ramban might have thought that it's actually inappropriate to go to doctors. It demonstrates a lack of faith. You don't believe that God can heal you, right? God is Ropei Cholim, not human beings. So much debated, but Tzitz Eliezer, in discussing that, Tzitz Eliezer was a master of medical halacha and had many, many volumes about medical questions in his Tshuvot. So he discusses this Ramban, and he says, we know from Ramban himself, his other writings, that obviously you're supposed to go to doctors. He himself was a doctor. The Ramban in Parshat Bechukotai was talking about a time when there are obvious miracles in everyday life. So if there are obvious miracles, then you can believe, then for sure, if God is doing miracles, God will be able to heal you without going to a doctor. But Bizman Hazeh, the life we live, the society we live in, obviously the appropriate choice is to go to the doctor. Okay, so Tanu Rabbanan. So how do we know that in a case where there was some kind of growths that came out of this wound, and then it opened up again and healed again and opened up again and healed again? So if it's all machmat hamaka, if it's all because of this injury, you still have to pay ripui and you still have to pay shevet. Okay, Talmud Omar, rak yitain v'rapo yirapeh, yachol afilu shelo machmat hamaka. So could you think that it even would apply if it's not something that was caused by the injury? Okay, because the pasuk seems to be very inclusive. Talmud Omar, rak, because the Torah says rak, so rak comes to exclude. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Omer af machmat hamaka patur. He says even if it's because of the injury, you're patur from paying for an extended wound that keeps opening and closing, opening and closing. Shenemar rak, because of the word rak comes even to exclude something like that. So then there are some people who would say even patur lagamre, you're totally exempt for an injury like that. Okay. Kirabanan batrai ikidamre af machmat hamaka patur meshevet v'chayav beripui kiman ke'abua. So the whole back and forth here is that there are a lot of ikadamres, and it gets tricky for the Rishonim to figure out how to paskin in those kind of cases, what the conclusion of the sugya is. But at least the way it seems here is that certainly ikadamre, the final voice, is that we would say af machmat hamaka patur legamre, that you might say actually that you should, if it's not anything related to even if it is related to the injury, if it's something extended or protracted, you probably are exempt. And then also that in such a case, you might be exempt from paying shevet, but you would still have to pay riput.
It says command kavua.
So that's kavua d'shmuel. We saw right going back.
And Rabbanan Batrai.
Rabbanan Batrai was the second rabbi's opinion of the right in this whole Shakavatari. That is the opinion of Rabbanan, who said that about the Eged Yetera, that you're protracting the illness or protracting the healing. So in that case, you would be exempt. Okay. Amar Mar, Yachol afilu shelo machman hamakat. So is it possible that you would have to pay even in a case where the wound was not actually caused by the injury? Tumodamar rak shelo machman hamaka. Okay. So shelo machman hamaka by kra. So does the Torah really have to even tell me that? That's so obvious. What if I get an injury that had nothing to do with the fact that the person hit me? So why should he have to pay for it, right? Okay, so Amrei, my shalom machman hamaka. What does it mean that it's not because of the injury? No, it's because you didn't listen to the doctor. That's the question. The achal dvash, and you ate honey. They thought, obviously, they knew that sugar is bad for you, at least at certain times. Or komine mitika, or sweets, mipnei shedvash v'komine mitika kashin lamaka. Because sugar is, if you eat sugar while you're sick, it's going to make it slower to heal. V'halemakato grogata. Where does that gargotani? It got some kind of a scab or a growth. So is it true that in that case, then, if the person punched me, and then it was healing fine, and then I went and ate candy, and then it got this horrible scab, and now I have to go to the doctor? Is that his fault? No, it's my fault. So Tumodamar rak, so my gargotani, so Amar Rabbi nata kirichta. It's some kind of like a bound up dead skin lesion, right? What?
The Rosh is basar mate.
Basar mate, so it gets into the gangrenous question or the necrosis of the skin. Okay, so obviously these are kinds of things that hopefully people don't ever have to deal with themselves. So my asute alo ala v'kiri v'kalba v'amarle asich ana amarle. Okay, might like 1 second. 1 second.
Allah is aloe.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, aloe is aloe.
Is the heel. Is
Right.
The cure. Right. That's the
I'm
cure.
going to take a look in this one because there are a lot of words here that I thought I had prepared well enough and not as well as I thought. 1 sec. Okay. All right, 1 second. All right. Right.
If you said asich ana, you say back to him.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So how do you cure this nata krichta? So either you put ahala, which is aloe, right? The kira is wax, and the kalba is a certain kind of a resin or a sap, the pitch from the trees. Okay. Okay. Yamarle asaich ana. I'll heal you myself. I'll be the doctor, right? The guy who punched him says, okay, I'm going to deal with it, right? Okay. Amarle damita la ka'arye arba. So he'll say back to him like, what? You're the lion. You're the guy who beat me up. Why am I going to trust you to be my doctor, right? So that's a question. Okay. So in other words, that the person doesn't think to say, okay, it'll be cheaper if I do it myself, so I'll offer to do it myself. So the person can refuse. The person gets to choose their doctor, basically. That's part of this question. Okay. The amarle maitina.
Obamacare.
I guess that's true.
Go out of the system and choose.
Something like
Never
that.
mind. Go ahead.
Okay, so my tina asia demage magan. So what if a person is going to come? What if there's a doctor who's going to treat you pro bono? So I'll go negotiate you a doctor who's going to do it pro bono. Okay, so what can he say back to him? Amar le asia demage magan magan shave. So a person who a doctor who's working for free doesn't do as good a job. He's worthless as a doctor. Why? Because there's a presumption that the amount of monetary motivation to do a good job, that is a sort of a basic notion of capitalism, is that if people are getting paid, they're going to do a better job than if they're not getting paid. People who go do volunteer work sometimes might feel that.
Dan, can you translate? What's the word? Magan.
Magan to be like to the cost. the Magan b'Magan to he'll pay.
Magan is a.
I think like schar, like it's the Aramaic word like a schar, some kind of a schar, yeah.
All right.
Like free for free. Free for free, or if he's free, he's nothing. Magan shaveh. So the other question, going back to the question of Nitan Reshut La Ropei La Rapot, so the Dag Zikanim on the Torah, from the Baalei HaTosfot, one of the commentaries on the Torah, says, obviously a doctor is allowed to be a doctor. That's not the question. There's no other profession the Torah feels like is necessary to say, oh, this profession, they have a right to do their job. The question is, how much are you allowed to charge for being a doctor? Because maybe you'll say it's a mitzvah to be a doctor. You're healing someone, you're helping someone, so you should have to do it for free because it's a mitzvah. Comes the Torah, to say that you actually have to pay for medical expenses. Exactly this point, which is that a doctor who's being paid is going to perform better than a doctor who has to work pro bono. Okay. I'll bring you a doctor from a faraway country. Maybe he's a better doctor, but it's going to cost more, or maybe it'll cost less. I guess the idea is that it'll cocost less. The doctors here are very expensive. I'll go bring you a doctor from Mexico who will charge you, half as much. The guy says, Amarle, Asia Rechika Ina Avira. A faraway eye is a blind eye, or a doctor from far away is a blind, either has a blind eye, that is, he doesn't know what's going on here, or he could make your eye blind. That is, a doctor from far away doesn't understand the way people around here live, or what their diet is, or things like that.
Also because he's leaving.
He'll leave eventually. He doesn't going to care about the long-term results. There's no follow-up. Right. So all of those kind of questions. So these are major questions. You could go through these sugyo very be'iyun and look at all the Rishonim and really draw it out to figure out, what modern doctors, how are they supposed to act, and what kind of things we can learn about in our lives as well. Okay. So what if he says, just give me the money and I'll go find a doctor for myself? Okay, so so you'll be negligent and you'll try to charge me more. That is what? If I let you be totally responsible for your own recovery, you're going to try to scam me. Now, obviously, it's kind of a strange suggestion because what? Because a person is going to a person is going to put their own life at risk, put their own health at risk just to try to earn back the amount of money that it was going to cost to heal anyway. They're not going to make any money off of that. But that's at least this kind of scam that they're worried about, so you don't allow that. What if he says, set a fixed price now and just fix that? That is, there's no way that it's going to be variable. It's not going to be based on actually how much it costs, and that way the person won't worry about trying to slow down their healing to overcharge. No, all the more so then in that case you're going to try to be negligent. So people are going to make fun of me. They're going to see that you didn't get better because I didn't give you enough money to heal, and then they're going to say that Karoli Shor Hamazik. They're going to call me Shor Hamazik. Now, of course, the literary point here to connect between Adam Hamazik and Shor Hamazik, right? A Shor Hamazik doesn't pay ripui. So the point is, if a person was injured by an ox and then goes and collects nezek, then the person is never getting paid for their medical expenses. So obviously, in this case of a person being underpaying for medical expenses, trying to close the deal early, then the person is going to have lasting complications. It's going to look like Shor Hamazik, because with Shor Hamazik also, you don't get paid for your medical needs. And so then that recovery, or there will be medical complications that come out of that. So a person would be worried about being compared to Shor Hamazik. He says, I'm okay if people know that I'm the guy who stabbed you, as long as you heal okay, so people don't think I'm a shore that gored you. Well, so right? It's more brutal. It's more inhuman.
Is it even today from antiquity? Doctors are pledged not to do no harm, right. And the Adam is muad le'olam. Right. In other words,
so that's another part of the reshut lerafot is Adam muad le'olam. What if a doctor causes, like you said, negligence,
cause damage by they just do.
Right, and human beings. So then the question is, what if a doctor has a malpractice question? As a doctor thought this would be beneficial and it turns out it's not, or a doctor made a mistake. So that's why a doctor needs a certain amount of reshut. You have to put yourself in the risk of trying to do something good, and then there might be complications. Okay, the Gemara continues. Okay, the Gemara continues. Tana, there is a bright. The kulan mishtamim b'makom nezek. So all of them, that is all the other four, get paid in the place of b'makom, meaning when you pay nezek, you also pay those other ones as well. And that really means that nezek doesn't exempt you from paying the other four. That is, the nezek is limited to the damage itself, and the other four cover other parts of the experience. Okay, So Tana Bekula Mishtam B'Makom Nezek Menani Milei. So where do we learn this from? Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rav Amar Kra Petza Tachat Patza. You have to pay. Where Petza is a wound for a wound. Okay, Litain Tsar B'Makom Nezek. So that teaches that you pay Tsar for pain and suffering when you also are paying for the nezek that is the damage, which we already discussed at length, the machloket about that between Ben Azai and Rabbi. Okay, so hi, mibai leila rabot, l'rabot shogeg kamezid, b'onis karaton. But don't we need petza tachat patza to include Adam Hamazik has to pay? A person who causes injury has to pay either in cases of shogeg kamezid, you have to pay even if it was unintentional as if it was intentional, onis karaton, or if it was totally accidental, as if it was you had awareness of it. It could have said wound by wound. Petza b'petza, or petza b'petza, my petza tachat petza, a wound for a wound. Shemamina tarte, we can learn both from that because there's an a sense of redundancy in the pasuk. Papa mashmei Rabba Amar, Papa quoted from Rabba Amar krab rapo yirapei. So the pasuk says you have to heal for it. Litain refuah b'makom nezek. So that's where it learned you have to pay refuah even when you're also paying for the nezek. That's like the Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, who already said that gets reshut la rofei. Shenitna reshut la rofei rapot. In kein yichtavarachmana verofei. So you and he should heal. Yirapei shmamina litain refuah b'makom nezek. So the redundancy is learned to apply to both. That is, there is a permission for doctors to heal, and you have to pay ripui b'makom nezek. But then how can you say that applies to the pasuk to apply to that you're obligated to pay ripui? You can lemakra o rapo o yirapei. Could either say rapo o yirapei. So the fact that it switches rapo yirapei, my rapo yirapei shemamina litain refuah b'makom nezek. You have to pay ripui even when you're paying for nezek as well. But that must imply that there is such a case where you would pay ripui even if there's no nezek. What case is that? Tsar. So it must be a case of tsar. That is, in a case of tsar, where you would pay tsar, you could also pay ripui even if there's no nezek, even if there's no lasting damage. Why? Because it could take some cost to actually heal that temporary injury. Look, tsar kava'o b'shipud with masmer. With this price, we already saw that if a person burns someone else with a stick or not a stick, a stake, or a nail, afilu al tziporno, even on his fingernail, makom sheino oseh chabura, a place that doesn't create a bruise, ripui dehavia ka'ivlei. So the fact that it hurts him, he also has some kind of a healing. He has to have some kind of medical expense. Okay. Sorry, I lost the place. So ka'ivlei, midi v'salik aitile sama charifa. So you have to give some kind of a very sharp medicine. The ointment is going to burn very much, or it is very sharp. And it bleached your skin. And then you have to give another medicine that's going to bring back color into your flesh. Okay, so in that case, and shave it. The hadike that when the person. So what is it? Shave it. So the hadkei idrona, where the person locked someone else in the room, or he closed him up in a box, ubatle, and he got him off work. That is, if someone locks you up forever, so they didn't cause you any physical damage, but they still took you off of work. So that could be shave it just by itself. And no nezek and no ripui, no tsar, but it was still time off of work. So boshet, and when could there be a case of boshet without any of the others? Boshet dirak le be'ape, if a person spit at someone else in the face. That is, it's embarrassing, but it doesn't cause any kind of physical damage. It doesn't cause you to take time off of work, maybe a minute here, a minute there, but that's not enough to be really evaluated. Okay, a few more minutes. Let's see how far we can get. Okay, so shevet. When we are evaluating shevet, we have a certain halachic minimum wage, it seems. The halachic minimum wage seems to be the amount of money that a person gets paid to serve as the watchman over a field of squash, like zucchinis or something. So we have to see what. So Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Shevet ro'ino to ki'ilu hu shomer kishuin. We assess him as if he is a squash watchman. V'im tomar lakha midat hadin v'chi mitfach hai gavra la agar de shomer kishuin. Who? So what do you mean? Meaning, is that really fair? Like, it's not really fair. Why? Because the person is gonna get up, and he's gonna be healed, and and he's not going to be paid to be a squash watchman, zucchini watchman. Why? Rather, Ella Adavla Vishakilagra. He's going to go work as a laborer to carry water, to draw water for people, and he'll get paid higher wages. Inami Adil Vishakilagra. Or he'll work as a shaliach, he'll work as a messenger, bike messenger, maybe something like that, delivering packages and doing people's butlering tasks.
These are all alternative standards for shevet.
Right, but what it's saying is that is it really fair to have such a low minimum wage if this person, once he heals, is certainly not going to be working as the watchman? He's going to work for a job that has a higher paying
even
wage.
if he can't go back to what he had been doing before, there are other standards that you could apply.
Right.
That's the way do you think that's correct reading? In other words,
Right.
why do the lowest?
Right. Why do the lowest? And what do they say? So the Gemara responds, Midat Hadin lo lakta. No, it's not any damage done to the Midat Hadin, to the sense of justice, to the sense of fairness. Why? Shekavar natan lo dmei yado dmei raglo. The fact that you already paid him for the injury, that is the person who had his hand cut off. You paid him the cost difference between a slave who has a hand and a slave who doesn't have a hand. So what does that mean? That includes the sense of how much money he's going to be able to earn even over a long period of time, many years, because that's the sense of how much he would sell for as a slave. And therefore, in that case, you've already paid for that damage done to his earning power. Now the only thing you're paying is a very minimal sense of this person has no work at all because he's recovering at home compared to the fact that he could be working a little bit. So that sense of a little bit of earnings, a very minimal sense of job, again, with all mamonos, we have to always go back to the core principle. We're trying to take someone else's money to pay for your expense, to pay for your time off of work. So we have to use a fair threshold in that sense as well, which is we have to have burden of proof, and we have to have a threshold of what's considered appropriate to actually take someone else's money. So the reason why it's such a low threshold is because you already paid for something which is actually have a protracted effect on his earning power. That is the injury done to his hand or to his foot. And now the only question is, well, what is the bare minimum that he could be earning at this point compared to nothing? Better than nothing.
What's the criterion that workman's compensation is calculated?
I have no idea about any of that.
Why? But it's sort of it's a similar.
Right. The same kind of question.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm a Rabbi. So what does Rabbi say? Okay. I'm a Rabbi. So if you cut off someone's hand, you pay him for the hand, that is the injury, and shave it, you calculate time off of work as if he's a shomer kishuin, the watchman for the zucchinis. Shiveret raglo, if you broke someone's foot, notein lo dmei raglo, you pay for the foot, v'shevet ro'ino to ki'ilu hu shomer hapetach. You assess him if he is a guardian at the gate, at the door. So why a different kind of shomer? And simet eino, if you blinded someone's eye, notein lo dmei eino, you pay for the eye, v'shevet ro'ino to ki'ilu hu matchino berichaim. He is working as a grinder at the millstone. Why? Because that's a job that doesn't require your eye at all. What's the difference? If you have no hand, you could still be a shomer hishuin. You can walk around the field and inspect and keep the birds away, but you can't do any manual labor because you have only one hand. Or you could do very limited amount of manual labor. The person who's broken his foot has to sit in one place. So he has to be shomer tapetach. He has to work at the toll booth. He has to work at the front gate of the city because he has to have a sitting down kind of a job. And a person who is blinded, that person has to have a job, is assessed at whatever kind of a job is a job that you would be able to do while blind. The question is whether some of these are actually even paid less than the shomer kishuim, presumably because they have lower demands. Okay. And what if a person made someone else deaf? You pay for his entire worth as a person, that is his slave value as a whole person. Why? Because presumably, and again, this is based on the rabbinic understanding, that a cheresh, a person who's deaf, is understood to have been a person who had no mental competence at all and was unable to function normally in society in any way, unable to communicate, unable to work. So in that sense, the person has a much higher liability in terms of nezek because they've incapacitated this person entirely, and at the same time, there's no shevet because the person has no potential working value at all. Obviously, the evaluation of a cheresh in modern times has changed significantly since the invention and discovery of really reanalysis of what it means to be deaf, and new ways that people who are deaf are able to communicate, obviously sign language and all other sorts of things, and a textual culture as opposed to a spoken culture and all sorts of things. Obviously, people who are deaf have much higher capability now than they did in the time of the Gemara.
The category, contemporary meaning of the category would be brain injury.
Right, some sort of really debilitating, person who's in,
That's right. You've caused an injury that has debilitated the person.
Totally debilitated to the point where they cannot
Cheresh.
work,
Right.
cannot communicate,
Right.
and really is totally unable to function in society at all.
Right.
And obviously, that kind of a thing is very different than deaf people in our society nowadays. We're having to stop there. Time is up, and we'll continue tomorrow.